It was growing late, and an immense weariness once more possessed her. It was not the stealing sense of sleep, but a vivid, wakeful fatigue, against which all the possibilities of the future were shadowed forth gigantically. There was the check in her desk, for instance. She meant to use it in paying her debt to Trenor, but she foresaw that when the morning came, she would put off doing so, would slip into gradual tolerance of the debt. The thought terrified her. She dreaded to fall from the height of her last moment with Lawrence Selden. She felt an immense longing to perpetuate the momentary exaltation of her spirit. If only life could end now, end on this tragic yet sweet vision of lost possibilities, which gave her a sense of kinship with all the loving and foregoing in the world. She reached out suddenly and, drawing the check from her writing desk, enclosed it in an envelope which she addressed to her bank. She then wrote out a check for Trenor, and placing it, without an accompanying word, in an envelope inscribed with his name, laid the two letters side by side on her desk. After that, she continued to sit at the table, sorting her papers and writing, till the intense silence of the house reminded her of the lateness of the hour. The terrible silence and emptiness seemed to symbolize her future. She felt as though the house, the street, the world were all empty, and she alone left sentient in a lifeless universe. But this was the verge of delirium. Sleep was what she wanted. She remembered she had not closed her eyes for 2 nights. The little bottle was at her bedside, waiting to lay its spell. She undressed hastily, hungering now for the touch of her pillow. But as soon as she had lain down, every nerve started once more into separate wakefulness. It was as though a great blaze of electric light had been turned on in her head, and her poor little anguished self cowered in it, without knowing where to take refuge. She put out her hand and measured the soothing drops into a glass. But as she did so, she knew they would be powerless against the supernatural lucidity of her brain. She had long since raised the dose to its highest limit, but tonight she felt she must increase it. She knew she took a slight risk in doing so. If sleep came at all, it might be a sleep without waking. But that was 1 chance in 100. The action of the drug was incalculable, and the addition of a few drops to the regular dose would probably do no more than procure for her the rest she so desperately needed. Tonight, the drug seemed to work more slowly than usual. Each passionate pulse had to be stilled in turn, like sentinels falling asleep at their posts. But gradually, the sense of complete subjugation came over her, and she began to wonder languidly what had made her feel so uneasy and excited. She had been unhappy, and now she was happy. She had felt herself alone, and now the sense of loneliness had vanished. She stirred once and turned on her side, and as she did, she understood why she did not feel herself alone. It was odd, but Nettie Struthers' child was lying in her arm. She felt the pressure of its little head on her shoulder. She did not know how it had come there, but she felt no great surprise at the fact, only a gentle, penetrating thrill of warmth and pleasure. She said to herself that there was something she must tell Selden, some word she had found that would make life clear between them. She tried to repeat the word, which lingered, vague and luminous on the far edge of thought. She was afraid of not remembering it when she woke, and if she could only remember it and say it to him, she felt that everything would be well. Slowly the thought of the word faded, and sleep began to enfold her. She struggled faintly against it, feeling that she ought to keep awake on account of the baby, but even this feeling was gradually lost in an indistinct sense of drowsy peace, through which, of a sudden, a dark flash of loneliness and terror tore its way. She started up again, cold and trembling with the shock. For a moment, she seemed to have lost her hold of the child. But no, she was mistaken. The tender pressure of its body was still close to hers. The recovered warmth flowered through her once more. She yielded to it, sank into it, and slept.
The next morning, Selden arrives at Lily's boarding house, ready at last to speak the word he had meant to say to her.
It was strange that it had not come to his lips sooner, that he had let her pass from him the evening before, without being able to speak it. Selden ran up the steps and pulled the bell. It came as a sharp surprise that the door should be opened so promptly, and by Gertie Farish, and that behind her, in an agitated blur, other figures ominously loomed. "Lawrence!" Gertie cried in a strange voice. "How could you get here so quickly?" A voice in the background said that the doctor might be back at any minute, and that nothing was to be disturbed upstairs. Then Selden felt that Gertie had taken him gently by the hand, and they were suffered to go up alone. Gertie opened the door, and Selden went in. Though the blind was down, the irresistible sunlight poured a tempered golden flood into the room, and in its light Selden saw a narrow bed along the wall, and on the bed, with motionless hands and a calm, unrecognizing face, the semblance of Lily Bard. He stood alone with the motionless sleeper on the bed. His impulse was to fall on his knees and rest his throbbing head against the peaceful cheek. But instead he turned and looked about, sternly compelling himself to regain his consciousness of outward things. The desk was closed, but on its slanting lid lay two letters. One bore the address of a bank, and Selden laid it aside. On the other letter he read Gus Trenner's name, and the flap of the envelope was still ungummed. Temptation leapt like the stab of a knife. Why had she been writing to Trenner, writing presumably just after their parting the previous evening? The thought unhallowed the memory of that last hour, made a mock of the word he had come to speak. He put the letter from him with sudden loathing and raised the lid of the desk. He saw a checkbook and a few packets of bills and letters. All the bills were receipted. There was not an unpaid account. He opened the checkbook. The very night before, a check of $10,000 from Mrs. Peniston's executors had been entered in it. But turning another page, he discovered that in spite of this, the balance had already declined to a few dollars. A glance at the stubs showed that $500 of the legacy had been spent in the settlement of bills, while the remaining thousands were comprehended in one check made out to Charles Augustus Trenner. Selden laid the book aside. He hid his face in his hands. It was true, then, that she had taken money from Trenner, but true also that the obligation had been intolerable, and at the first opportunity she had freed herself from it, though the act left her face to face with unmitigated poverty. That was all he could unravel of the story. The mute lips on the pillow refused more than this, unless indeed they had told him the rest in the kiss they had left upon his forehead. He saw that all the conditions of life had conspired to keep them apart, since his detachment from the external influences which swayed her had increased his spiritual fastidiousness and made it more difficult for him to love uncritically. But at least he had loved her, had been willing to stake his future on his faith in her, and if the moment had been fated to pass from them before they could seize it, he saw now that for both, it had been saved whole out of the ruin of their lives. It was this moment of love, this fleeting victory over themselves, which had kept them from extinction, which, in her, had reached out to him in every struggle against the influence of her surroundings, and in him had kept alive the faith that now drew him, penitent and reconciled, to her side. He knelt by the bed and bent over her, draining their last moment to its lees, and in the silence there passed between them the word which made all clear.